Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today we bring you a new story, the shocking downfall of King Solomon, how the wisest man in history destroyed his own kingdom. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and now let's begin the story. Solomon did not fall because he was foolish. He fell because wisdom alone could not save a man who stopped obeying it. He was the richest king of his age, the builder of God's temple, the author of wisdom literature, and the most intellectually gifted ruler in biblical history. Yet by the end of his life, the same man who once asked God for discernment was bowing before foreign gods and setting the stage for the destruction of his own kingdom. His downfall was not sudden. It was slow, rational, strategic, and terrifyingly human. This is the complete story of how the wisest man in history engineered his own destruction. Solomon's downfall is tragic, not merely because he failed, but because he began with advantages almost no human being in history has ever possessed. Most fallen leaders collapse after rising from struggle. Corrupted by power they spent their lives chasing. Solomon was different. He did not claw his way to the top through war, betrayal, or political ambition. He inherited the summit. He was born into privilege that no previous king of Israel had known, the son of David. Heir to the greatest military conqueror in the nation's history, raised inside the palace of a kingdom forged by blood and secured by victory. By the time Solomon took the throne, many of the battles that had defined his father's reign were over. The enemies had largely been subdued, the borders expanded, the kingdom stabilized. David had done the brutal work of conquest. Solomon inherited peace. He inherited a united nation, immense wealth stored in royal treasuries, military strength already established, international respect already earned, and perhaps most significantly, he inherited divine favor attached to the Davidic covenant itself. His kingship was not merely political, it was theological. He ruled with the weight of a promise from God hanging over his throne. From the beginning, Solomon was not trying to build a kingdom from ruins. He was handed one already standing. And this is what makes his story so unsettling. Because many men fail due to lack of opportunity, lack of guidance, lack of resources, or lack of support. Solomon had none of those excuses. He began with every advantage. He had a father who gave him direct instruction about covenant faithfulness. He had priests, prophets, scribes, and elders surrounding him with the accumulated wisdom of Israel's spiritual and political leadership. He had wealth enough to finance projects no king before him could imagine. He had security enough to govern without constant military desperation. He had legitimacy enough that his throne carried authority from the first day. In modern terms, Solomon inherited what every ambitious person believes would finally solve their problems: power, money, security, influence, reputation, and divine endorsement. And yet, his life would become proof that external blessings cannot protect a man from internal decay. In fact, Scripture presents Solomon's rise in a way that intentionally emphasizes how extraordinary his starting point was, because the greater the privilege, the more severe the warning of his eventual collapse becomes. He did not begin broken. He did not begin compromised. He began blessed. But blessing, contrary to what many assume, is not the end of moral testing. Sometimes it is the beginning of a more dangerous kind. Hardship tests whether a man will trust God in suffering. Prosperity tests whether he still needs God in success. And history repeatedly shows that prosperity is often the harder test. A desperate man knows he needs help. A successful man can slowly begin to believe he is the reason for his own greatness. Solomon's environment made that temptation especially lethal. He grew up not in wilderness, but in luxury, not in uncertainty, but in security, not in crisis, but in abundance. He was raised in a court where his father's legendary victories had already created national confidence, where the machinery of state already functioned, where servants attended every need, where the symbols of greatness surrounded him daily. This does not mean Solomon was doomed by privilege, but it does mean he faced a unique spiritual danger. Men forged in hardship often know their dependence. Men raised in abundance can mistake inherited blessing for personal invincibility. And yet Solomon's story does not begin with arrogance. That is important. He begins not as a villain, but as a young ruler fully aware of how unprepared he is for the task before him. He understood, at least initially, that inheriting greatness is not the same as being ready to sustain it. He inherited the throne of a legendary king, but inheritance cannot transfer character. It cannot transfer discipline. It cannot transfer spiritual maturity. A crown can be placed on a head in a day, but the soul required to bear it must be forged over time. Solomon stepped into leadership with enormous expectation pressing down on him. Israel was no ordinary nation in its own self-understanding. It was a covenant people with a sacred identity, ruled under divine law, carrying the memory of Abraham, Moses, Joshua, and David. To lead such a people was not merely administrative responsibility, it was spiritual accountability. Solomon was expected to govern politically, judge wisely, preserve covenant faithfulness, maintain justice, and represent God's rule before the nations. He was young, inexperienced, and standing beneath a burden large enough to crush many older men. This tension is crucial to understand because it reveals the paradox at the heart of Solomon's story. He had every external advantage, yet still felt internal inadequacy. And in that moment, his awareness of weakness became the most promising thing about him. Before Solomon became dangerous, he was humble. Before he became self-deceived, he was self-aware. Before success inflated him, responsibility sobered him. That humility would become the foundation of his early greatness, but also the standard against which his later transformation would appear even more devastating. Because the tragedy of Solomon is not that a reckless fool ruined a kingdom. The tragedy is that a man who began with extraordinary blessing and genuine humility gradually lost the very inner posture that made him worthy of those blessings in the first place. His story begins at the summit, not so that we admire his fortune, but so that we understand the magnitude of what was eventually lost. Solomon started where most men dream of finishing. He possessed advantages kings would kill for, wealth nations envied, peace rulers prayed for, and favor few humans ever receive. Yet none of it could secure his future. Because the greatest threat to a man is not what he lacks, but what he does with what he has been given. Solomon's life will show that privilege can become poison when character fails to keep pace with blessing, that inherited greatness can collapse in the hands of one who is not spiritually prepared to steward it, and that beginning with everything is no guarantee of ending well. In many ways, Solomon's downfall began long before idolatry, long before foreign wives, long before judgment. It began with a silent danger hidden inside extraordinary success, the temptation to live surrounded by gifts while slowly forgetting the giver. And that is what makes his story timeless, because most people assume destruction comes through suffering, failure, or visible rebellion. But Solomon proves something far more unsettling. A man can begin with every blessing imaginable, every advantage, every opportunity, every sign of divine favor, and still lose everything if his soul does not mature at the same rate as his success. Solomon inherited the summit, but inheriting the summit is not the same as being able to remain there. If Solomon had begun his reign with arrogance, his downfall would be far less surprising. But what makes his story compelling is that the young king did not initially resemble the man he would later become. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon displayed something rare among rulers, especially rulers born into privilege, an honest awareness of his own limitations. He understood that inheriting a throne did not automatically make him fit to rule, and that recognition set the stage for one of the most remarkable moments in biblical leadership. According to the biblical account, early in his reign, God appeared to Solomon and offered him an extraordinary invitation. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." It is difficult to overstate how staggering that offer was. A young monarch standing at the threshold of immense power is given unrestricted access to divine favor. He could have asked for military dominance to secure his borders forever. He could have asked for wealth beyond calculation. He could have asked for the death of political enemies who still threatened his legitimacy. He could have asked for long life, dynastic stability, fame, invincibility, or pleasure. Any one of those requests would have been understandable. Most kings in the ancient world spent their reigns obsessed with exactly those things: survival, conquest, security, and legacy. But Solomon's answer revealed a depth of humility that distinguished him from nearly every ruler around him. He did not ask for power. He asked for wisdom. More specifically, he asked for discernment, the ability to govern rightly, judge fairly, and lead well. He confessed openly that he felt like a little child, inexperienced and inadequate for the responsibility before him. This was not false modesty. It was an unusually honest admission from a man standing on the most powerful throne in his world. And this is why his request was so extraordinary. Solomon recognized that the greatest challenge before him was not defeating enemies outside the kingdom, but ruling wisely within it. He understood that leadership is not sustained by force alone. Armies can secure borders, but they cannot create justice. Wealth can fund projects, but it cannot produce wisdom. Power can compel obedience, but it cannot teach discernment. Solomon saw what many leaders never learn: that competence of soul matters more than strength of position. His first instinct as king was not to expand his authority, but to ask for the internal capacity required to bear it. In many ways, this moment represents the spiritual high point of Solomon's life. Because before he became known for wisdom, he desired wisdom. Before he became celebrated for brilliance, he understood his need for guidance. Before success hardened him, responsibility humbled him. And according to the biblical narrative, God was deeply pleased by this request. Solomon's desire for wisdom, rather than self-serving gain, was treated as evidence of a rightly ordered heart. He was not merely granted wisdom, he was granted what he did not ask for as well: wealth, honor, and influence beyond any king of his generation. But hidden within this blessing is one of the great ironies of Solomon's story. The very gifts added because of his humility would later become the environment in which that humility eroded. The man who asked for wisdom because he knew he lacked it would eventually live as though wisdom alone made him untouchable. Yet at this early stage, Solomon's heart appears aligned. He understood a truth many leaders resist: that awareness of one's limitations is not weakness, but strength. Inexperience acknowledged can be taught. Ignorance confessed can be corrected. Pride, however, is nearly impossible to help because it refuses to admit need. Solomon's greatness began not with intelligence, but with humility. And that distinction matters because wisdom in the biblical worldview is not mere mental brilliance. It is not IQ, strategic thinking, or verbal skill. Biblical wisdom is moral discernment, the ability to align judgment with truth, to see reality clearly, and to govern life in harmony with God's order. Solomon was not asking simply to be smarter than others. He was asking to become the kind of man capable of leading with justice under divine authority. That is why his request mattered so much. He was not seeking information, he was seeking formation. And for a time, that request transformed him into exactly the kind of ruler Israel needed. But Solomon's later collapse forces us to confront a painful truth. Receiving wisdom is not the same as remaining wise. Wisdom is not a permanent inoculation against failure. It is not a mystical force that overrides character. It can be possessed intellectually while ignored practically. A man may understand truth deeply and still choose against it. Solomon would eventually become living proof that insight without discipline can produce a more sophisticated form of self-destruction. Because the wiser a person is, the more capable he becomes of rationalizing his own compromise. But none of that was visible yet. At this stage in the story, Solomon stands as the ideal young ruler, humble, teachable, spiritually aware, and conscious of the moral seriousness of leadership. He knew that the throne he inherited demanded more than charisma. It demanded judgment. More than ambition. It demanded restraint. More than confidence. It demanded dependence. And perhaps that is why his early reign remains so compelling even to modern audiences. In a world where many seek power first and competence later, Solomon sought competence before power consumed him. He understood that having authority without wisdom is dangerous, and that ruling others before mastering oneself is a recipe for disaster. Tragically, the very self-awareness that marked his beginning would slowly fade as success accumulated around him. The man who once said, "I am not adequate for this task," would one day govern as if no limits applied to him at all. But in this moment, before the corruption, before the excess, before the divided heart, Solomon shines as a rare example of a leader who understood that the first qualification for greatness is recognizing that you are not great enough on your own. His request for wisdom was extraordinary, not simply because wisdom is valuable, but because it revealed a young king who feared becoming powerful without becoming worthy of power. He knew that a throne magnifies whatever sits upon it, that if a foolish man gains authority, his foolishness becomes national tragedy, and if a wise man rules well, an entire people can flourish. Solomon's prayer was extraordinary because it demonstrated something deeper than intelligence. It demonstrated reverence. He understood that leadership under God required more than talent. It required submission to truth greater than oneself. Yet the haunting tension of his story is that the man who began by asking for wisdom would later violate much of the wisdom he had received. The one who feared inadequacy would later act above accountability. The one who sought discernment would later compromise in ways he once would have condemned. And that transformation is what makes Solomon's life more than ancient history. It becomes a warning. Because many people begin well, many start humble, dependent, and sincere. Many seek wisdom before they seek success. But beginnings do not determine endings. Character must be maintained, not merely established. The humility that opens the door to greatness must survive the greatness it creates. Solomon asked for wisdom because he knew he needed it. His downfall would begin when he no longer lived like that was true. With wisdom granted and divine favor resting visibly upon him, Solomon entered a season of success so extraordinary that even centuries later his reign would be remembered as the golden age of Israel. If David had built the kingdom through conquest, Solomon perfected it through administration, diplomacy, architecture, commerce, and unmatched political order. Under his rule, Israel was no longer merely a regional tribal nation struggling for survival. It became an international power, wealthy, stable, feared, admired, and strategically influential in a world dominated by empires. The biblical portrait of Solomon's kingdom is intentionally overwhelming in its scale because the authors want the reader to feel the weight of what he achieved. Silver, we are told, became as common in Jerusalem as stones. Cedar imported from Lebanon filled royal projects on a scale previously unimaginable. Merchants, kings, and dignitaries traveled from distant lands to witness his wisdom and his court. Trade routes flourished under his administration. International alliances expanded his reach. The kingdom's economy surged through taxation, commerce, tribute, and strategic partnerships. For many in Israel, Solomon's reign must have felt like the fulfillment of every national dream: peace on every side, prosperity in every household, and a king whose fame extended beyond their borders. This was not simply a successful reign. It was a civilizational high point. But the centerpiece of Solomon's achievements, both politically and spiritually, was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. For generations, Israel's worship had centered around the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary carried through the wilderness and into the land. David had long desired to build a permanent house for the Lord, but that task was reserved for his son. Solomon became the man chosen to fulfill that vision. The temple was not merely an architectural project. It was the symbolic heart of the nation, the visible center of Israel's covenant identity, the place where heaven and earth were understood to meet in sacred representation. To build it was to cement his place in history, not only as king, but as the ruler who established the spiritual and national center of Israel for generations. The project itself reflected staggering wealth and ambition. Massive quantities of gold, bronze, cedar, precious stones, and skilled labor were devoted to its construction. The temple stood as both theological statement and political monument, a declaration that Israel had entered a new era of settled power, divine favor, and institutional maturity. When it was completed and dedicated, the moment represented the visible peak of Solomon's life. He had not merely inherited a kingdom, he had elevated it. He had done what no king before him had accomplished. He had transformed inherited blessing into visible glory. From every external measure, Solomon had become the model of successful leadership. He possessed wisdom, wealth, reverence, influence, and historical achievement all at once. And yet, this is precisely where the danger began. Because success, especially sustained success, creates a psychological environment unlike failure. Failure humbles. Failure exposes weakness. Failure reminds people of their dependence. Success does the opposite if left unchecked. Success can create the illusion that one's blessings are earned rather than entrusted. It can quietly shift a person from gratitude to entitlement, from dependence to self-sufficiency, from stewardship to ownership. And Solomon's reign had now reached a level where that temptation became almost unavoidable. Imagine the daily atmosphere surrounding him. Foreign dignitaries arriving to praise his wisdom, citizens prospering under his policies, wealth flowing into his treasuries, massive building projects testifying to his greatness, songs sung about his achievements, historians recording his legacy in real time. Every visible metric affirmed that he was succeeding beyond expectation. Few environments are more spiritually dangerous than constant affirmation without crisis. Because the human heart is not naturally equipped to handle uninterrupted success without slowly beginning to believe its own mythology. Solomon had once asked for wisdom because he felt inadequate. But what happens when year after year, everything you touch prospers? What happens when every project succeeds, every rival fades, every treasury expands, every visitor praises your greatness, and your name becomes synonymous with unmatched human excellence? What happens is that success can begin to blur the line between confidence and pride. It can make a person forget that giftedness is not self-generated. It can convince a leader that because his decisions have worked so often, his judgment is beyond question. And perhaps most dangerously, it can create the illusion that visible blessing is proof of permanent divine approval, regardless of what is happening internally. This is where many people misunderstand Solomon's downfall. They imagine his collapse began when he turned to idolatry, but by then the deeper problem was already well underway. Public rebellion was the symptom, not the start. The real danger began here, at the height of success, when Solomon possessed everything a man could want and lived in an environment where almost no one would dare question him. Because the more extraordinary a person's success becomes, the harder it often is for them to hear correction. Admiration can isolate leaders from truth. Power can insulate them from accountability. Wealth can remove natural restraints. Solomon had achieved what few human beings ever do. He built something magnificent, ruled effectively, expanded influence, gained universal respect, and secured a legacy that looked indestructible. But outward achievement and inward health are not the same thing. A man can build monuments while neglecting his soul. He can construct greatness publicly while decaying privately. He can become historically successful while becoming spiritually vulnerable. And that is the haunting paradox of Solomon's peak. The period in which he looked strongest externally may have been the period when he became most fragile internally. Because for many people, the greatest moral dangers do not emerge in seasons of loss, but in seasons when life appears untouchably good. When there is no crisis to force self-examination, no adversity to expose weakness, no desperation to drive dependence, and no suffering to remind the soul of its limits. Solomon's reign had become the peak of human achievement in almost every visible category. He had wealth beyond imagination, wisdom beyond peers, peace beyond predecessors, and glory beyond rivals. He stood at the summit of what most people spend their lives chasing. And yet his story will soon reveal one of Scripture's most uncomfortable truths, that a man can gain everything the world calls success and still be moving toward ruin. Because success itself is not proof of spiritual health. Achievement is not evidence of character. Prosperity is not the same as faithfulness. Solomon's greatness made him admired by the world. But admiration from the world is never guaranteed integrity before God. In fact, history repeatedly shows that some of the most dangerous moments in a person's life occur not when they are climbing, but when they have arrived. Because once a man reaches the summit, the temptation is no longer to strive upward, but to believe he belongs there by his own right. Solomon had reached the peak of human achievement. The tragedy is that the summit which should have inspired deepest gratitude would instead become the place where his slow descent quietly began. When people think about Solomon's downfall, they usually picture the final scandal, the foreign wives, the pagan altars, the king of Israel bowing before gods he once would have condemned. But by the time Solomon built altars to foreign deities, his decline had already been unfolding for years. Idolatry was not the beginning of his corruption. It was the final, public manifestation of a much deeper internal drift. The first signs of Solomon's downfall appeared not in his worship, but in the structure of his rule. They emerged quietly beneath the brilliance of his achievements, hidden behind the gold, the monuments, and the applause. Because moral collapse rarely begins with obvious rebellion. It usually begins with subtle compromise that can still be defended, justified, and even praised by those who benefit from it. Solomon's kingdom looked glorious from the outside, but the machinery sustaining that glory came at a growing cost. His massive building projects, the temple, the royal palace, fortified cities, military infrastructure, administrative centers, and luxury estates required more than vision. They required labor on an enormous scale. According to the biblical account, Solomon conscripted workers for state projects and imposed heavy burdens of taxation and labor upon the people. What had once been a kingdom of covenant identity increasingly began to resemble the imperial systems of surrounding nations, where centralized power extracted from the population in order to sustain royal grandeur. This is deeply significant, because Israel's kings were never meant to rule like pagan emperors. The biblical ideal of kingship was restrained authority under divine law, leadership accountable to covenant standards, not absolute monarchy fueled by exploitation. Yet Solomon, the wisest king in Israel's history, began structuring his reign in ways that mirrored the very political systems Israel had been called to remain distinct from. And this is where the first real fracture appears. His heart had not yet turned to idols, but his leadership had begun drifting from covenant ideals towards self-exalting empire. His wisdom was still operational, but now increasingly directed toward expansion rather than restraint, toward maximizing greatness rather than preserving faithfulness. He was still successful, still admired, still externally righteous by most public standards. But the internal orientation of his leadership had begun to shift. The kingdom no longer existed merely as something to steward under God. It was becoming something to enlarge under Solomon. This is the danger of power when success goes unchallenged. A leader can begin by serving a mission, then gradually reshape the mission around serving his own vision of greatness. Solomon's projects were not inherently evil. Building infrastructure, strengthening defenses, expanding trade, and centralizing administration can all be legitimate acts of governance. The problem was not the existence of ambition. The problem was the slow transformation of ambition into excess. His reign began moving beyond wise stewardship into imperial overreach, and because the changes were gradual, they likely did not feel corrupt at first. That is how compromise often works. It does not arrive announcing itself as betrayal. It arrives dressed as pragmatism, strategy, efficiency, or necessity. Solomon may have viewed these decisions as practical statecraft, the unavoidable demands of maintaining a great kingdom. But Scripture's portrait suggests something deeper, that beneath the strategic brilliance was a subtle but growing appetite for expansion, luxury, and visible greatness. The man who once asked for wisdom to govern well was now building a kingdom increasingly centered on magnificence. And magnificence can become addictive. Once a leader begins measuring success by scale, by wealth, by monuments, by visible legacy, restraint becomes harder to maintain. Enough is never enough when image becomes identity. Solomon's external greatness was now feeding internal appetites that would eventually outrun his discipline. This matters because corruption often begins not when a person starts doing obviously wicked things, but when their desires begin quietly reordering around self-exaltation. A man can still appear moral while his heart is shifting. He can still speak rightly, worship publicly, and govern effectively, while slowly becoming driven by motives that would have once alarmed him. Solomon had not abandoned God. He had not renounced wisdom. But the seeds of his downfall were already growing in the soil of unchecked success. His priorities were changing. His appetite for greatness was expanding. His sense of restraint was weakening. And perhaps most dangerously, all of it was happening while his reputation remained untarnished. No scandal had exposed him. No prophet had publicly denounced him yet. No visible catastrophe had interrupted his ascent, which meant the corruption remained invisible to most observers, perhaps even to Solomon himself. This is one of the most sobering patterns in human nature. People often recognize destruction only when it becomes dramatic, but by then the true damage has usually been accumulating for years. Public collapse is typically the final chapter of a much longer internal story. Solomon's idolatry would one day shock the nation, but long before he bowed to false gods, he had already begun bowing to subtler idols: achievement, expansion, legacy, magnificence. The intoxicating need to build something increasingly centered around himself. He may still have believed he was serving God. That is what makes this stage of corruption so dangerous. The most deceptive compromises are not those we know are wrong, but those we can plausibly frame as wise. Solomon was too intelligent to descend through obvious recklessness. His downfall would come through rationalized excess, through compromise sophisticated enough to look strategic, through ambition cloaked in wisdom. And this is why his story remains profoundly relevant. Many people do not destroy themselves through sudden rebellion. They drift through gradual justification. They make one compromise at a time, each small enough to defend, each practical enough to excuse, each beneficial enough to avoid scrutiny, until the cumulative effect becomes spiritual transformation. By the time obvious sin appears, the heart has often been changing for years. Solomon's first sign of corruption was not pagan worship. It was the subtle reordering of his leadership around greatness rather than faithfulness, around expansion rather than obedience, around visible success rather than covenant restraint. His public religion still remained intact, but his internal compass had begun to drift. And that drift is what makes his story so unsettling. Because most people imagine downfall begins when someone clearly abandons their values. Solomon shows that it often begins much earlier, when a person still appears righteous, still functions effectively, still achieves impressively, but has started making decisions from desires that no longer align with the principles they claim to serve. The corruption of Solomon did not start at the altar of a false god. It started in the quiet places of ambition, where greatness slowly became more compelling to him than obedience. And once that shift occurs in the heart, the rest of the downfall becomes only a matter of time. By this point in Solomon's reign, the danger was no longer whether he would become successful. The danger was what success would begin doing to him. Because prosperity does not merely change a man's circumstances, it changes the psychological and spiritual environment in which he lives. And unless a person possesses unusual discipline, prolonged success can distort self-perception in ways failure never does. Solomon had now entered a world where almost every external signal reinforced the idea that he was exceptional. His judgments were praised, his projects succeeded, his wealth multiplied, his kingdom flourished, foreign rulers sought his counsel, and his reputation spread across nations. Everywhere he turned, reality appeared to confirm the same message. You are unlike other men. You are wiser, more gifted, more favored, more capable. That message, repeated long enough, becomes dangerous to any human heart. Because one of the greatest spiritual threats in history has never been suffering, but the slow intoxication of success. Hardship keeps many people aware of their limits. It reminds them of dependence, vulnerability, and need. Success can erase that awareness. It can create the illusion that one's outcomes are primarily the result of one's own brilliance. Gratitude slowly turns into entitlement. Dependence turns into self-confidence. Stewardship turns into ownership. And nowhere is that transition more dangerous than in a person who genuinely is gifted. Solomon was not merely imagining his greatness. He truly was extraordinary. He was more insightful than his peers, more capable than most rulers, more accomplished than nearly anyone in his generation. That is what made his temptation uniquely perilous. Pride is easiest to detect when it forms around delusion. It is harder to detect when it forms around real excellence. A mediocre man who believes himself brilliant is often corrected by reality. But a truly gifted man may receive enough success to justify nearly every elevated opinion he forms about himself. Solomon's abilities were so exceptional that pride could root itself not in fantasy, but in truth exaggerated beyond proper proportion. This is why gifted people often face temptations less obvious but more dangerous than others. Their competence can gradually teach them the wrong lesson. It can make them believe that because they are right often, they are right almost always. Because they have succeeded repeatedly, their judgment is inherently trustworthy. Because they have been blessed, they must be uniquely exempt from ordinary limitations. Solomon may never have consciously thought such things in crude terms. Pride rarely speaks that bluntly. More often, it whispers in subtler forms. It says, "My judgment has earned trust. My discernment has proven itself. My success validates my instincts. I know where the boundaries are. I can manage what would destroy lesser people." That is a psychology of many great downfalls. People do not suddenly decide to become self-destructive. They gradually begin believing their strengths make them safer than others. Solomon's wisdom, which should have made him more cautious, may have instead made him more confident in his ability to navigate danger without being consumed by it. And this is one of the central ironies of his life. The very gift meant to guard him may have become one of the tools through which he rationalized compromise. Because intelligence often increases a person's capacity to justify what desire already wants, a less intelligent man may fall through impulsive foolishness. A brilliant man can fall through carefully reasoned self-deception. Solomon's success also created another vulnerability: insulation from correction. As kings become more powerful, fewer people are willing to confront them honestly. Advisors become cautious. Subordinates become flattering. Critics become politically inconvenient. The higher a person rises, the easier it becomes for them to live in an environment where truth is filtered before it reaches them. Solomon had reached a stature where almost everyone around him had incentive to affirm him. His court depended on his favor. His kingdom prospered under his rule. Foreign dignitaries praised him. The world celebrated him. In such an atmosphere, even a wise man can begin to lose the friction necessary for self-examination. Accountability weakens when admiration grows too loud. This is why many successful people become more vulnerable precisely when they appear strongest. Their gifts create achievements. Their achievements create admiration. Admiration creates insulation. Insulation weakens correction. And without correction, blind spots deepen unchecked. Solomon's world had become structured around affirming his greatness while increasingly shielding him from the internal drift taking place beneath it. But perhaps the deepest danger success created was spiritual complacency. In earlier years, Solomon knew he needed God because the task before him exceeded his strength. But now, after years of flourishing, what urgent need remained visible? The kingdom was stable, the treasury was full, enemies were subdued, his wisdom was validated, his legacy was expanding. There is a subtle temptation in prosperity to continue honoring God ceremonially while relying on Him less existentially. A person may maintain religious practice while slowly losing practical dependence. They still acknowledge God in theory, but inwardly begin living as if their world runs quite well without desperate need for Him. This is often how spiritual drift occurs among the successful. Not through open rejection of God, but through quiet replacement of dependence with self-sufficiency. Solomon had not ceased believing in God, but belief alone is not the same as dependence. A man may affirm truth intellectually while no longer living from conscious need of it. And once success teaches a person to trust themselves more than they trust the source of their success, vulnerability has already entered the soul. This is why prosperity can be a harsher test than suffering. Suffering drives people toward help. Success tempts them to believe they have become the help. Solomon's life now stood at a dangerous intersection. Extraordinary blessing combined with diminishing humility. He still possessed wisdom, but the posture that once made him seek it with trembling dependence was beginning to erode. He had become so successful that the conditions sustaining his success were now quietly undermining his character. And this is what makes his story universally relevant. Because many people assume that if they just achieve enough, earn enough, build enough, or become successful enough, their deeper struggles will disappear. Solomon proves the opposite. Success does not remove internal weakness. It magnifies it. It exposes whether character has grown enough to bear the weight of blessing. If not, the very things a person prayed for can become the instruments of their ruin. Solomon's success made him vulnerable, not because success is evil, but because success without sustained humility becomes spiritually destabilizing. The more extraordinary the gift, the more dangerous it becomes in the hands of someone who forgets why it was given. And Solomon was slowly forgetting. The man who once trembled before responsibility was becoming comfortable with greatness. The king who once knew he needed wisdom was beginning to live as though wisdom belonged naturally to him. The ruler who once depended on God was slowly learning to depend on Solomon. And once a man begins trusting himself more than the truth that formed him, collapse may not come immediately, but it has already begun. When modern readers encounter the story of Solomon's many wives, they often reduce it to a simple moral lesson about lust or sexual excess. But that interpretation, while partly true, misses the deeper and more politically significant reality of what was happening. Solomon's marriages were not merely romantic indulgences. They were instruments of statecraft, calculated diplomatic alliances woven into the geopolitical fabric of the ancient Near East. In the world Solomon ruled, royal marriages were among the most powerful tools a king possessed for securing peace, expanding influence, and stabilizing borders. To marry the daughter of a foreign king was not simply to gain a wife, it was to forge a treaty, create mutual interests, and transform potential enemies into political partners. Many of Solomon's marriages were likely viewed by surrounding nations and perhaps by his own court not as moral compromise, but as evidence of strategic brilliance. He was doing what sophisticated rulers did. He was expanding Israel's security not through war, but through diplomacy. He was binding kingdoms to himself through blood rather than conquest. From a purely political perspective, it was intelligent. That is what makes this stage of Solomon's downfall so dangerous and so psychologically realistic. His compromise did not arrive in the form of obviously reckless behavior. It arrived through strategic decisions that looked wise by worldly standards. This is one of the most important truths in Solomon's story. Not every intelligent decision is a faithful one. Not every effective strategy is righteous simply because it works. Some compromises succeed politically while failing spiritually. And Solomon, perhaps more than any man alive, was gifted enough to make compromise look brilliant. The issue was not that diplomacy itself was sinful. The issue was that God had explicitly warned Israel's kings against multiplying wives, especially through foreign alliances, because such relationships would inevitably pull their hearts toward divided loyalties. The command was not arbitrary. It reflected a deep understanding of human nature. Marriage is never merely administrative. Intimate bonds reshape affections. Shared life alters loyalty. Repeated exposure influences values. To unite oneself deeply with those devoted to other gods was not simply political complexity. It was spiritual danger built into the structure of the relationship itself. Solomon knew this. He was not ignorant of the command. That is what makes his choices so revealing. He did not violate God's warning because he lacked understanding. He violated it because he likely convinced himself he could manage the risk. This is where gifted people often fall hardest. They assume that because they understand the danger, they can control it. Solomon may have believed that his wisdom, maturity, and devotion made him capable of doing what would compromise lesser men without being compromised himself. He could marry foreign wives for political advantage, maintain diplomatic relationships, and still preserve spiritual integrity. He could enjoy the benefits of strategic compromise without paying its deeper costs. That is the logic of nearly every rationalized downfall. People rarely choose destruction directly. They choose what seems manageable. They assume they can approach danger without succumbing to it. They believe awareness of temptation equals immunity from temptation. Solomon was not likely pursuing rebellion. He was likely pursuing advantage while trusting himself to remain unaffected. But human beings are rarely as invulnerable as they imagine, especially when desire and ambition align. And Solomon's marriages did not remain moderate. They multiplied far beyond strategic necessity into staggering excess. 700 wives and 300 concubines, according to the biblical account. At that scale, the issue was no longer merely diplomacy. Political alliances may explain the beginning, but they do not fully explain the magnitude. What may have started as strategic compromise expanded into appetite unrestrained. The man who justified initial compromise for practical reasons eventually lost all proportion. This is another common pattern of corruption. Sin often enters under rational justification, but grows beyond its original excuse. What begins as calculated exception becomes normalized behavior. Boundaries once crossed become easier to cross again. Moderation gives way to appetite. The person who believes they were managing compromise eventually becomes shaped by it. Solomon's marriages reveal not only political strategy, but the progressive nature of indulgence. His wisdom did not prevent him from excess. It may have simply made him better at justifying the first steps toward it. And perhaps most importantly, these marriages signaled a profound shift in Solomon's trust. Earlier in his reign, Solomon had depended on God's wisdom to secure the kingdom. But now, his policies suggest growing dependence on worldly mechanisms of control, alliances, treaties, diplomatic leverage, and strategic positioning. Again, these tools were not inherently evil, but in Israel's covenant framework, kings were repeatedly warned not to secure themselves through the same means pagan rulers trusted in. Their security was meant to rest ultimately in covenant faithfulness, not political accumulation. Solomon's multiplying alliances reflected more than pragmatic governance. They suggested a king increasingly building security through human systems rather than spiritual trust. He was constructing layers of protection and influence through worldly power while likely convincing himself he remained fully faithful. That is what makes compromise so deceptive. It rarely feels like betrayal while it is happening. It feels like prudence. It feels like adaptation. It feels like maturity, complexity, realism. The person compromising often believes they are simply navigating life wisely in a complicated world. Solomon's marriages looked sophisticated, strategic, and effective, but beneath that sophistication was a simple reality. He was repeatedly choosing advantage over obedience. And repeated compromise, no matter how intelligent, always reshapes the heart. The man who once asked for wisdom to rule under God was now building his life in ways God had explicitly warned against, all while likely retaining enough religious devotion to convince himself nothing essential had changed. But everything essential was changing. His heart was being conditioned by repeated disobedience normalized through success. His affections were being distributed among competing loyalties. His environment was being filled with influences fundamentally at odds with covenant faithfulness. His life was becoming structured around compromise, sophisticated enough to look responsible. Solomon's marriages were more than romance. They were the visible architecture of a divided heart being built in slow motion. Every alliance strengthened his kingdom externally, while weakening his soul internally. Every politically advantageous union made him more powerful in the eyes of nations, while making him more vulnerable before God. He was securing peace around his borders while planting conflict within his heart. And that is the tragedy of strategic compromise. A person can gain what they want externally while losing what they need internally. Solomon believed, as many brilliant people do, that he could harness dangerous things for beneficial purposes without becoming subject to them. He believed he could manage compromise. He believed he could stand close to the fire without burning. But no man, however wise, is so disciplined that he can repeatedly build his life around disobedience and remain unchanged. Solomon's downfall did not begin because he loved pleasure too much alone. It began because he trusted his own wisdom enough to believe he could violate clear boundaries without suffering their intended consequences. His marriages were not random indulgence, they were calculated compromises. And that is precisely what made them so destructive. Great moral collapse rarely happens in a single moment. It is usually the final visible result of an invisible process, a long erosion of conviction, desire, and self-restraint that occurs gradually enough for the person experiencing it to barely notice the change. Solomon did not wake up one morning and decide to betray everything he once believed. His downfall was not the story of sudden rebellion. It was the story of a divided heart, a heart that still honored God in part while increasingly giving itself to other loyalties. And that is what makes his corruption so psychologically believable. Because most people do not abandon their values all at once. They drift from them one compromise at a time until what once would have horrified them eventually feels normal. The biblical text is strikingly precise in how it describes Solomon's condition. It does not first say that he rejected God intellectually. It says his wives turned away his heart. That language matters. His downfall was not initially doctrinal, it was relational and emotional. His heart, the center of affection, desire, loyalty, and devotion, was slowly being reoriented. This is one of Scripture's deepest insights into human nature. People rarely live according to what they merely know. They live according to what they love. A person can understand truth clearly and still fail to obey it if their desires move elsewhere. Solomon's problem was no longer lack of wisdom. His problem was disordered affection. He still knew what was true. He simply no longer loved it above competing desires. And this is why intelligence alone has never been enough to preserve integrity. Knowledge can inform the mind, but it cannot by itself govern the heart. A person may understand discipline while craving indulgence, understand faithfulness while desiring compromise, understand truth while emotionally preferring illusion. Solomon had become a man whose intellect still affirmed God, while whose heart increasingly drifted elsewhere. He had not necessarily rejected his faith publicly. More likely, he had simply stopped loving God with the exclusivity that covenant faithfulness required. His devotion became divided, and divided devotion always produces instability. A heart split between competing ultimate loyalties cannot remain whole for long. This internal division likely happened so gradually that it felt almost harmless at first. Each new relationship introduced another set of customs, another worldview, another set of expectations within the palace. Foreign wives did not simply bring beauty or companionship. They brought cultures, traditions, spiritual practices, and religious loyalties deeply embedded in their identities. To maintain peace within such relationships would require accommodation. To preserve affection would require tolerance. To keep domestic harmony among hundreds of politically significant wives would demand increasing flexibility regarding their beliefs and practices. Solomon may initially have drawn lines. He may have told himself certain boundaries would never move. But repeated exposure normalizes what once felt foreign. Emotional attachment softens convictions people once held firmly. What begins as tolerance often becomes participation, if not through belief, then through accommodation. And that is the subtle power of prolonged compromise. It reshapes not only behavior, but perception. Things that once seemed dangerous begin to feel ordinary. Boundaries once viewed as sacred begin to feel negotiable. Convictions once defended passionately begin to appear unnecessarily rigid. Solomon's heart was being retrained by the environment he had built around himself. Day after day, year after year, he lived immersed in relationships and influences fundamentally at odds with the exclusive devotion his covenant required. No matter how wise he was, no human heart remains untouched by the environment it repeatedly inhabits. We become shaped by what surrounds us, what we normalize, what we repeatedly accommodate, and what we learn to stop resisting. Solomon's divided heart was not merely the result of isolated bad decisions. It was the predictable outcome of structuring his life around prolonged spiritual compromise. But perhaps the most dangerous part of a divided heart is that it allows a person to maintain the illusion of faithfulness while already drifting from it. Solomon likely still saw himself as a worshiper of the Lord. He likely still participated in temple worship, still honored Israel's traditions, still regarded himself as fundamentally faithful. Yet covenant faithfulness was never meant to be partial. The God of Israel did not demand primary loyalty among many loyalties. He demanded exclusive devotion, and Solomon's heart no longer belonged wholly to him. This is the essence of divided-heartedness, not total rejection of what is right, but refusal to let it remain supreme. It is the attempt to preserve allegiance to truth while also preserving attachment to competing loves. It is the desire to keep God without surrendering everything else. And that condition is spiritually unstable because divided hearts always drift toward whatever they love most in practice. Solomon's life now embodied one of the most sobering truths in Scripture. A person can retain religious identity while inwardly drifting far from the principles that identity demands. Outward forms can remain intact long after inward devotion weakens. Public worship can continue while private loyalties shift. Reputation can remain righteous while the heart grows compromised. Solomon's corruption was dangerous precisely because it was gradual, sophisticated, and initially invisible. He was not a pagan king rejecting God outright. He was a covenant king whose loves had become disordered while his public identity remained intact. That is often the most deceptive form of spiritual decline, because it allows a person to continue seeing themselves as faithful while no longer living with undivided allegiance. And once the heart becomes divided, outward compromise becomes only a matter of time, because eventually behavior follows affection. The things we repeatedly tolerate inwardly will sooner or later manifest outwardly. Solomon's divided heart was the true turning point of his downfall. Before this, his compromises were strategic, structural, political. But now the corruption had moved deeper. It had reached the center of desire itself. His issue was no longer simply what decisions he was making, but what kind of man he was becoming. He had spent years building a kingdom of unmatched external order while internally becoming a man of increasing disorder. His wisdom still existed, his power still remained, his success still continued. But beneath it all, the most important part of him was fragmenting. And once the heart fractures, no amount of intelligence can keep the rest of life intact forever. Solomon's story warns that people rarely destroy themselves by abandoning truth overnight. They destroy themselves by slowly allowing competing loves to share the throne of the heart until truth no longer rules uncontested. His downfall began not when he stopped believing in God, but when he stopped loving God enough for obedience to remain non-negotiable. The wisest man alive was becoming a divided man, and divided men eventually fall. There are moments in history so morally jarring that they feel almost impossible to comprehend. Moments when a person's actions stand in such direct contradiction to everything they once represented that the mind struggles to reconcile the two versions of who they have become. Solomon building altars to foreign gods is one of those moments. This was not merely another compromise in a long sequence of compromises. This was the public, undeniable collapse of the man who had once built the temple of the Lord. The king who had overseen Israel's holiest structure, who had prayed one of the most reverent dedications in Scripture, who had asked for wisdom to govern God's people, was now using royal authority to institutionalize idolatry in the very land entrusted to him. The symbolism is staggering. The same hands that built the house of worship for the God of Israel were now commissioning places of worship for gods Israel had been commanded to reject. And that contradiction is precisely the point. Solomon's downfall had reached its final visible stage. What had begun as internal drift, then strategic compromise, then divided affection, had now matured into open rebellion embodied in policy and architecture. He was no longer merely tolerating foreign beliefs in private. He was legitimizing them publicly. According to the biblical account, Solomon built high places for deities such as Chemosh, Molech, and Ashtoreth, gods associated not merely with alternate spirituality, but with practices Israel regarded as profoundly corrupt and morally destructive. Whether Solomon personally embraced all associated practices is not the primary issue. The issue is that he used covenant kingship the office entrusted to preserve Israel's faithfulness, to sponsor the very systems of worship that undermined it. This is what makes the moment so devastating. His private compromise had become public leadership. His personal divided heart had become national influence. And that is the unavoidable reality of leadership. Private corruption never stays private when held by those with power. Whatever a leader tolerates inwardly eventually shapes what they permit outwardly. And what they permit outwardly eventually shapes the culture around them. Solomon's sin was no longer merely personal. It had become structural. It was now woven into the spiritual life of the kingdom itself. But perhaps the most haunting question in this chapter of his life is not what Solomon did. It is how he justified doing it. Because men rarely arrive at such contradiction believing themselves to be villains. It is far more likely that Solomon rationalized these actions through the language of peace, tolerance, diplomacy, or domestic stability. He may have told himself that allowing his wives places of worship was an act of relational generosity. He may have framed it as political wisdom, a necessary concession to preserve harmony in the royal household and maintain diplomatic alliances. He may even have convinced himself that permitting others their beliefs did not threaten his own. That is often how advanced compromise works. By the time a person publicly violates what they once believed sacred, they have usually built an internal system of justification sophisticated enough to make betrayal feel reasonable. Solomon did not need to stop believing in God in order to do this. He only needed to stop treating obedience as absolute. He only needed to convince himself that exceptions could be made, that complexity required flexibility, that mature leadership demanded nuance, that rigid faithfulness was unrealistic in a complicated world. But truth does not cease being truth because circumstances become complicated. And disobedience does not become wisdom because it is politically sophisticated. Solomon had reached the point where his brilliance was no longer protecting him from compromise. It was empowering him to explain it. That is one of the most dangerous stages of corruption, when intelligence no longer serves truth, but begins serving desire. When a person's mind becomes not an instrument for discernment, but a defense attorney for appetite. Solomon likely still possessed extraordinary intellectual clarity. He likely could still speak wisdom, analyze wisely, and govern effectively in many areas. But wisdom in theory means little when the heart no longer submits to it in practice. This is the tragedy at the center of his life. The wisest man alive became a man whose conduct openly contradicted his own wisdom. His failure proves a truth modern culture often resists. Intelligence is not character. Insight is not integrity. The ability to articulate truth is not the same as willingness to obey it. A person may understand righteousness deeply while choosing against it repeatedly. And when such a person holds great power, the damage multiplies beyond themselves. Solomon's idolatry did not affect only Solomon. It reshaped a nation. The king of Israel was not a private citizen free to compartmentalize his beliefs. He was the symbolic and practical leader of the covenant people. His actions established norms. His compromises modeled legitimacy. If the king could honor foreign gods, then foreign gods must not be so dangerous after all. If the builder of the temple could sponsor alternate worship, then exclusive devotion to the Lord could not be that essential. Leadership always teaches, even when it is not trying to. Solomon's behavior preached louder than any sermon ever could. And what it preached was devastating. That covenant faithfulness was now negotiable at the highest level of Israel's society. This is why Scripture treats Solomon's idolatry not merely as personal weakness, but as national betrayal. He was entrusted to preserve the spiritual identity of the people, and instead he used his power to erode it. The man who once centralized worship around the temple was now decentralizing devotion through sanctioned idolatry. He had become the architect of the very spiritual fragmentation his office was meant to prevent. And yet perhaps the saddest part of this moment is not simply the sin itself, but what it reveals about how far Solomon had fallen from who he once was. There was a time when the thought of this would have horrified him. There was a time when the young king who trembled under the weight of leadership and begged God for wisdom would never have imagined himself here. But that is how gradual corruption works. It moves a person step by step into realities their former self would scarcely recognize. No one plans to become this compromised. They arrive there through 1,000 tolerated exceptions. Solomon's altars to foreign gods were shocking, not because they appeared suddenly, but because they revealed where years of unchecked compromise had been leading all along. The builder of God's temple had become a builder of rival altars because long before he changed his actions publicly, he had changed his loyalties privately. His life now stood as one of the most sobering reversals in Scripture. A man can begin with genuine devotion, rise to extraordinary blessing, achieve historic greatness, and still become the very opposite of what he once embodied if he repeatedly allows compromise to shape his heart. Solomon had not simply stumbled, he had become a living contradiction, a man who publicly honored what privately replaced God in his heart. And once the king who built the temple began building altars to other gods, the moral collapse was complete. The only thing left was judgment. By the time Solomon's downfall became visible to everyone, many would have assumed they understood the cause. They would point to the foreign wives, the luxury, the wealth, the sexual excess, the political alliances, the pagan altars, and say that these were the reasons the wisest king in history collapsed. But those things, while real, were not the deepest cause. They were manifestations of something more fundamental. Solomon did not ultimately fall because of women, money, pleasure, or power alone. He fell because of pride. The subtle and fatal conviction that he could live near disobedience without being mastered by it, that his wisdom made him safer than the commands he had been given. This is the deepest diagnosis of his life. Solomon's core failure was not ignorance. It was self-trust, elevated above obedience. He knew the boundaries. He understood the warnings. He had more insight into human nature than perhaps any man of his age. Yet he repeatedly acted as though understanding danger was equivalent to immunity from danger. And that is one of the oldest and most destructive lies in human history. Pride rarely appears first as arrogance in speech. More often it appears as exaggerated confidence in one's ability to manage what destroys others. It says, "I know the risks, but I can handle them. I know the boundary, but I know how far I can go. I understand the consequences, but I will stop before they reach me." That mentality defined Solomon's compromises from the beginning. He did not ignore God's commands because he lacked access to truth. He ignored them because he trusted his own judgment enough to believe exceptions could be made in his case. He believed he could take foreign wives without losing covenant loyalty. He believed he could pursue political strategy without spiritual corruption. He believed he could tolerate idolatrous influence without eventually participating in it. He believed he could build a life around repeated compromise and remain inwardly untouched. That is pride in its most dangerous form. Not crude rebellion, but sophisticated self-confidence that treats divine boundaries as guidelines rather than necessities. Solomon's downfall was not caused merely by desire. Many people experience strong desires. Desire becomes destructive when pride convinces a person they can indulge it safely outside the boundaries meant to restrain it. Pride always tells a person they are the exception. It whispers that ordinary warnings apply to ordinary people, not to someone as disciplined, experienced, gifted, or intelligent as you. And if any man had reason to believe he was exceptional, it was Solomon. He truly was unlike most people. His wisdom was extraordinary, his success was unprecedented, his gifts were undeniable. But exceptional gifting often produces exceptional temptation, because the more capable a person is, the easier it becomes to believe they are above vulnerabilities that govern others. Solomon's intelligence likely made him more vulnerable to this, not less. Lesser men may have feared certain compromises because they knew their own weakness. Solomon may have feared them less because his strength made him trust himself too much. This is the paradox of giftedness. The very qualities that elevate a person can become the basis of their destruction if they begin trusting the gift more than the God who gave it. Solomon's wisdom became dangerous the moment he treated it as sufficient protection against disobedience. Because wisdom was never meant to replace obedience, it was meant to direct it. No amount of understanding makes rebellion safe. No amount of insight neutralizes the moral consequences of violating truth. Yet Solomon lived as though his discernment gave him room to negotiate with boundaries that existed precisely because human hearts are not as trustworthy as they imagine. At its core, Solomon's pride was theological before it was behavioral. He did not merely overestimate himself. He underestimated the seriousness of disobedience and the frailty of the human heart. He believed he could control forces Scripture warned would control him. He believed proximity to corruption would not reshape him. He believed his past faithfulness and present wisdom could compensate for ongoing compromise. But no one is wise enough to repeatedly violate truth without eventually being altered by it. Not because God is arbitrary, but because reality itself is structured in such a way that disordered living produces disordered souls. Solomon thought he could use wisdom to manage sin. Instead, sin slowly taught him how little wisdom matters when no longer obeyed. This is why his story is more than a warning against lust or greed. It is a warning against self-deception among the gifted. Many people do not ruin themselves because they lack intelligence. They ruin themselves because they trust their intelligence too much. They believe awareness is enough. They believe analysis is enough. They believe being able to explain moral truth means they are living by it. Solomon demonstrates the terrifying gap that can exist between understanding righteousness and practicing it. A person can write wisdom literature and still live foolishly. A person can counsel others rightly while destroying themselves privately. A person can be brilliant enough to diagnose everyone's weakness while blind to the pride animating their own. That was Solomon's tragedy. He was wise enough to understand truth deeply, but proud enough to believe understanding it excused him from fully submitting to it. And pride of that kind is especially destructive because it rarely feels like pride to the person experiencing it. It feels like realism. It feels like maturity. It feels like nuanced judgment. It feels like informed flexibility. Solomon may never have thought of himself as arrogant. He likely saw himself as sophisticated, discerning, capable of navigating complexities others could not. But pride often hides beneath the belief that one's judgment has become reliable enough to revise the rules. Once a person begins treating their own discernment as superior to the boundaries that formed it, downfall is already underway. That is the real reason Solomon fell, not because he lacked wisdom, but because he stopped placing wisdom beneath obedience. He elevated his own judgment above the limits God had established. He trusted his capacity to manage compromise more than he trusted the wisdom of the commands warning him against it. And in doing so, the wisest man alive committed the oldest folly in human history, believing he could define for himself what was safe, rather than submitting to the limits designed for his good. Solomon's life proves that brilliance is not enough to save a person from ruin. Talent is not enough. Insight is not enough. Success is not enough. Even divine gifting is not enough if the heart beneath it becomes proud. Because the greatest danger to wisdom is not ignorance. It is the moment wisdom begins trusting itself more than the truth that gave it birth. Solomon did not fall because he was too weak to understand righteousness. He fell because he was proud enough to believe he could live outside it and survive. And once a man believes that, no amount of intelligence can save him from what comes next. For years, Solomon had lived as though his compromises carried no immediate cost. His kingdom still prospered, his throne remained secure, his wealth continued to increase, his public image endured. And this is often the most dangerous phase of moral decline, the period when a person sins repeatedly and nothing appears to happen. No visible punishment falls, no catastrophe interrupts the pattern, no immediate consequences force reflection. In that silence, many begin believing the oldest lie of all, that because judgment has not arrived, it will not arrive. But delayed consequences are not canceled consequences, and in Solomon's story, the silence eventually ended. According to the biblical narrative, God confronted Solomon directly and declared that because he had turned his heart away and violated the covenant, the kingdom would be torn from his dynasty. The judgment was devastating, not merely because of what was lost, but because of what it meant. Solomon had spent his life building a unified empire of unmatched glory. And now God announced that the very structure he had devoted himself to enlarging would fracture because of him. The kingdom would not remain whole. The legacy he believed he was securing would collapse. Yet even in judgment there was restraint. For the sake of David, the division would not occur during Solomon's lifetime, but under his son. One tribe would remain under his line, preserving the covenant promise. But the larger kingdom would be torn away. This partial mercy did not lessen the severity of the sentence. In some ways, it intensified the tragedy. Solomon would live knowing that the destruction of his life's work had already been decreed, that the kingdom he had strengthened externally was now spiritually condemned from within. The empire would survive him briefly, but its fracture had become inevitable. And this is where Solomon's story reveals one of the most sobering truths about leadership. A person can succeed publicly for years, while privately setting in motion consequences that will outlive them. Solomon's compromises did not end with Solomon. They reached into the next generation. His son would inherit not only the throne, but the instability created by his father's failures. His people would inherit not only prosperity, but the spiritual fracture introduced by his compromises. His nation would inherit not only monuments, but judgment woven into its future. This is the nature of legacy. A leader's private corruption never remains confined to the leader. It spills outward into institutions, families, cultures, and generations. Solomon had once been entrusted with the highest form of stewardship, a united kingdom at peace, blessed by God, strengthened by covenant promise. And through repeated compromise, he transformed that inheritance into a fractured future. The man who inherited greatness would now pass down division. But the judgment did not remain merely prophetic. The biblical account notes that adversaries began rising against Solomon during his later reign, signaling that the unraveling had already started before his death. Political opposition increased. External enemies emerged. Internal threats multiplied. The peace that had defined his reign began to crack. This is profoundly important, because judgment in Scripture often arrives not only through dramatic catastrophe, but through the gradual removal of stabilizing favor. The systems that once worked effortlessly begin resisting. The ease that once defined a person's life gives way to strain. The protection once taken for granted begins to withdraw. Solomon had built a kingdom of remarkable order, but now disorder was entering the structure from every side. What had looked invincible was becoming fragile. And perhaps most tragically, Solomon lived long enough to witness the early signs of that unraveling. He could see the cracks forming in what he had spent decades constructing. He could watch opposition rise where peace once prevailed. He could sense that the kingdom's future no longer rested secure. This is part of the severe mercy of judgment. Sometimes a person is forced to live long enough to see what their choices have done. Not always in full, but enough to understand that what was built through greatness can be undone through compromise. Solomon's judgment also exposes a critical truth often forgotten by those intoxicated with success. Divine blessing in the past does not guarantee divine approval in the present. Many assume that because God once favored them, their future is secure regardless of present disobedience. Solomon's life destroys that illusion. No past faithfulness, no prior blessing, no spiritual achievement, no sacred history exempted him from accountability once his heart turned. The man who built the temple was still judged for idolatry. The king who once pleased God with humility was still held accountable when humility gave way to pride. This is because past obedience cannot purchase permission for future rebellion. Legacy cannot substitute for faithfulness. Reputation cannot replace integrity. Spiritual history cannot compensate for present corruption. Solomon may have believed, consciously or not, that his past devotion, his wisdom, his achievements, and his covenant status gave him margin. That perhaps a man who had done so much for God could survive some compromise. But judgment proved otherwise. The same God who blessed Solomon in his humility confronted him in his rebellion. Favor had never meant exemption. It had meant responsibility. And that reality makes Solomon's collapse all the more tragic. He was not judged because God had been harsh. He was judged because the standards he violated were the very standards he had once been entrusted to uphold. The greater the calling, the greater the accountability. The more influence a person holds, the more serious their corruption becomes. Solomon's fall was not merely the failure of a private believer. It was the corruption of a covenant king whose decisions shaped an entire nation. His judgment had to reflect the scale of his responsibility. Yet beneath the political consequences lies an even deeper tragedy, the collapse of his legacy. Solomon had spent his life building permanence, monuments, institutions, wealth, order, influence, the kind of achievements people assume will secure immortality through remembrance. But in the end, the thing he could not preserve was the one thing that made all the others matter: covenant faithfulness. And once that was lost, everything else became unstable. This is the bitter irony of his life. The man who built the most glorious kingdom in Israel's history could not preserve it for one generation after himself. The king who amassed incomparable wealth could not buy stability. The leader who possessed extraordinary wisdom could not engineer his way out of moral consequence. The builder of Israel's golden age became the architect of its coming fracture. God's judgment upon Solomon was not merely punishment, it was revelation. It revealed that no level of gifting exempts a person from accountability, that no greatness can protect a compromised soul forever, and that the collapse of legacy often begins long before the collapse becomes visible. Solomon had everything most people spend their lives pursuing: wisdom, power, wealth, influence, admiration, achievement, and historical significance. Yet in the end, none of it could shield him from the consequences of a heart that had drifted too far. His kingdom still stood for the moment. His throne still remained. His reputation still lingered. But the verdict had been spoken. The fracture was coming. His legacy was broken. And the greatest king of Israel after David would die knowing that the empire he built would not survive him whole. If the historical narrative of Solomon's life shows us how he fell, the book traditionally associated with his later reflections may reveal what that fall felt like from the inside. Whether one reads Ecclesiastes as Solomon's direct autobiographical reflection, or as wisdom literature framed through his persona, the portrait it offers is hauntingly consistent with the psychology of a man who had reached the summit of human achievement and discovered that the summit could not save him. Few texts in ancient literature speak with such weary honesty about the limits of pleasure, wealth, achievement, and worldly greatness. The voice in Ecclesiastes does not sound like a man who failed to obtain what he wanted. It sounds like a man who obtained everything and found it insufficient. Again and again the refrain appears: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The Hebrew term behind that phrase carries the sense of vapor, breath, mist, something elusive, insubstantial, impossible to grasp permanently. This is not the language of a cynic who never tasted success. It is the language of someone who exhausted success and discovered its inability to satisfy the deepest longings of the human soul. If Solomon's life represents the greatest experiment in earthly fulfillment ever undertaken by a biblical king, Ecclesiastes reads like the final report of that experiment. He pursued wisdom and found that knowledge alone could not heal the human condition. He pursued pleasure and found indulgence incapable of producing lasting joy. He pursued monumental achievements and discovered that building great things does not silence inner emptiness. He accumulated wealth beyond imagination, only to realize that possessions cannot deliver peace to the possessor. He embraced labor, accomplishment, luxury, status, and legacy, and still arrived at the same conclusion. None of it could bear the weight of ultimate meaning. This is why Ecclesiastes matters so much in understanding Solomon's downfall. It suggests that beneath the visible collapse of his kingdom lay a deeper internal collapse already recognized by Solomon himself. The painful realization that he had spent years pursuing what could never truly satisfy him. The man who possessed more than almost any human being in history became the witness against the illusion that more is enough. And that realization is tragic precisely because Solomon did not learn it from deprivation. He learned it from abundance. Most people live believing their dissatisfaction would disappear if only they had more. More money, more beauty, more pleasure, more influence, more freedom, more recognition, more success. Solomon's life stands as the biblical rebuttal to that fantasy. He had more than nearly anyone before or after him, and still concluded that abundance without rightly ordered devotion leaves the soul empty. But Ecclesiastes reveals more than disappointment. It reveals regret. Beneath its philosophical observations lies the tone of a man looking back over years of striving and recognizing how much of what consumed him was ultimately hollow. There is a weariness in the text, not merely intellectual but existential. The weariness of someone who has tested every avenue of worldly fulfillment and found each one unable to answer the deepest questions of meaning, mortality, and purpose. He built, acquired, enjoyed, expanded, tasted, explored, and mastered, yet could not escape the final reality that death reduces all earthly achievement to something painfully temporary. The wise die like fools. The rich leave wealth to others. Builders leave monuments they cannot inhabit forever. Kings leave kingdoms to heirs they cannot control. Everything under the sun eventually slips from human grasp. For a man like Solomon, obsessed with greatness, this realization must have been devastating, because it meant that much of what he had spent his life constructing was less permanent than he once believed. The empire he expanded would fracture. The wealth he gathered would pass to others. The monuments he built would weather. The pleasures he consumed would fade. The admiration he enjoyed would not preserve him from death. The same man once celebrated as the greatest ruler of his age was forced to confront the reality that achievement cannot conquer mortality, and success cannot satisfy the soul when detached from eternal purpose. This does not mean Ecclesiastes rejects all earthly joy. Quite the opposite. It repeatedly affirms that work, food, companionship, and pleasure can be gifts when received rightly. But its central warning is that these gifts become empty when treated as ultimate ends rather than subordinate goods. Solomon's apparent regret was not that earthly blessings are evil. It was that he spent too much of his life asking temporary things to provide permanent meaning. He treated gifts as substitutes for the giver. He asked success to provide significance, pleasure to provide fulfillment, wealth to provide security, and achievement to provide identity. None of them could. That is the final lesson of his life. The man who had everything discovered that everything is not enough when the soul is disordered. And this realization transforms Solomon's story from mere cautionary tale into profound human tragedy. His downfall was not only political, it was existential. He did not merely lose divine favor and fracture a kingdom. He spent years chasing forms of greatness that could never deliver what he ultimately needed. He learned too late what many never learn at all, that external abundance cannot compensate for internal emptiness, and that no amount of achievement can rescue a person from the consequences of misplaced worship. If Ecclesiastes reflects Solomon's mature understanding, then his later years were marked not simply by punishment, but by painful clarity. He saw through the illusions that had seduced him. He recognized the vanity of the pursuits that once captivated him. He understood that much of what the world admires most is incapable of carrying ultimate weight. And perhaps that is why the book ends not in despair, but in sober conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. After everything, after all the wealth, all the women, all the building, all the wisdom, all the striving, all the glory, the final lesson is startling in its simplicity. The meaning Solomon searched for in greatness was found where he had first begun, in humble reverence before God. That is what makes his story so powerful and so tragic. The answer he spent his life searching for at the end was the answer he already possessed at the beginning. But somewhere along the way he drifted from it. Solomon's regret, if Ecclesiastes indeed captures it, was not merely that he sinned. It was that he wasted years pursuing substitutes for what he already knew was true. He had everything the world promises will fulfill a person, and he became the one qualified above all others to testify that the promise is false. The legacy of Solomon is therefore not simply that the wisest man fell. It is that the wisest man learned through painful experience that wisdom itself means nothing if it is not lived, that blessing becomes emptiness when detached from obedience, and that all the treasures of earth cannot quiet the soul of a man who has lost sight of what matters most. Solomon began his life asking for wisdom. He ended it knowing that wisdom without faithfulness had not been enough to save him. Solomon's story still unsettles people thousands of years later because it destroys one of the most comforting illusions human beings cling to: the belief that intelligence, success, talent, wealth, and opportunity are enough to secure a good life. Modern culture constantly tells people that if they can just become smart enough, disciplined enough, rich enough, influential enough, educated enough, or successful enough, they can build a life beyond serious collapse. We are taught to believe that ruin happens mainly to the foolish, the reckless, the unprepared, the weak. But Solomon's life stands as a permanent contradiction to that belief. He was not foolish in the ordinary sense. He was not untalented, lazy, naive, or lacking opportunity. He possessed advantages beyond what most human beings could ever imagine. He had brilliance that stunned nations, wealth that dwarfed kingdoms, power that shaped history, and spiritual knowledge deeper than nearly anyone around him. Yet none of it saved him from himself. And that is what makes his story terrifying. It suggests that the greatest threats to a person's life may not come from external enemies, but from internal corruption left unmanaged beneath extraordinary success. Solomon proves that giftedness can build greatness, while character quietly rots underneath it. He proves that wisdom can coexist with self-deception, that brilliance can rationalize compromise, and that a person may understand truth deeply while living increasingly far from it. That possibility is deeply unsettling, because it means collapse is not reserved for the ignorant. It means talent does not immunize against destruction. It means even the most capable people can become architects of their own downfall if they stop governing themselves with the same seriousness they use to govern everything else. And perhaps this is why Solomon's story feels more relevant in the modern world than many ancient narratives. We live in an age obsessed with optimization, achievement, self-mastery, and success. People build careers, brands, fortunes, influence, platforms, and reputations with relentless intensity. Entire cultures now train people to maximize output, sharpen intellect, expand wealth, and accumulate status. Yet amid all that striving, Solomon's life asks a haunting question. What if external success grows faster than internal character? What if a person becomes powerful before becoming disciplined enough to survive power? What if someone builds an extraordinary life outwardly, while neglecting the moral architecture required to sustain it inwardly? That is not merely Solomon's story. It is the story of countless modern collapses. Again and again, history shows gifted leaders, brilliant founders, celebrated thinkers, admired pastors, powerful executives, and influential public figures, undone not by lack of competence, but by lack of character. Their downfall shocks the public because their external excellence had convinced everyone, including themselves, that they were secure. But success often hides weakness better than failure does. A person can function at a high level while privately decaying for years. Achievement can delay exposure. Reputation can conceal dysfunction. Competence can make corruption harder to detect. Solomon's life reveals that external flourishing is not reliable proof of internal health. Someone may look blessed, admired, productive, and historically significant, while quietly becoming unstable at the center. This is why his story terrifies modern people, because it warns that many lives do not collapse because of failure. They collapse because of success they were not spiritually or morally prepared to survive. Many people can endure hardship better than abundance. Hardship keeps them dependent, humble, disciplined, and aware of need. Success tempts them to trust themselves, indulge themselves, excuse themselves, and slowly place themselves above the standards that once shaped them. Solomon's life is not merely about a king who sinned. It is about the universal human tendency to confuse giftedness with maturity, accomplishment with integrity, and visible blessing with inner health. But Solomon also terrifies, because his story exposes how gradual destruction often is. Most people imagine ruin arriving dramatically, through sudden catastrophe or obvious rebellion. Solomon shows something more unnerving, that a life can unravel incrementally while still appearing impressive. A person can remain admired while drifting. They can remain productive while compromising. They can remain outwardly successful while inwardly fragmenting. Downfall often begins not with scandal, but with subtle shifts, small compromises, tolerated pride, rationalized indulgence, divided loyalties, and slow erosion of humility. By the time collapse becomes public, the deepest damage has usually already been done. That pattern is frightening precisely because it is so ordinary. It means downfall is rarely the result of one catastrophic choice. It is more often the cumulative result of many manageable compromises no one thought would matter enough to destroy them. Solomon's story also terrifies because of what it says about human nature itself. If the wisest man in biblical history could deceive himself, rationalize compromise, and drift into ruin, then no one is beyond vulnerability. No amount of intelligence makes someone immune to temptation. No amount of spiritual knowledge eliminates the need for vigilance. No past faithfulness guarantees future integrity. Solomon had every advantage, yet still fell. Which means the decisive issue in life is not merely what gifts a person possesses, but whether their character remains governed by truth when those gifts multiply. In the end, Solomon's life leaves modern audiences with a sobering but necessary conclusion. The true measure of a person is not how high they rise, but whether their soul remains intact while rising. Not whether they achieve greatness, but whether greatness reshapes them into someone unrecognizable. Not whether they gain the world's admiration, but whether they preserve the inner order required to carry that admiration without being destroyed by it. Solomon reached heights few humans ever will. He tasted what most spend their lives chasing. He stood at the summit of power, wisdom, wealth, pleasure, and influence. And from that summit, his life sends a warning down through history, telling every generation the same uncomfortable truth. A man can gain everything the world calls success and still lose what matters most. That is why Solomon's story still terrifies modern people, because deep down, everyone knows the possibility remains that a person can win outwardly while losing inwardly, can build an empire while destroying the soul required to enjoy it, can become extraordinary in the eyes of the world while quietly becoming hollow within. Solomon's life forces every serious reader to confront the same question. Not whether success is dangerous for some people, but whether they themselves possess the character to survive the very blessings they are asking for. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all.